Before we get to our next presentation, I want to introduce the man who is solely responsible for getting the North Dakota Policy Council off the ground. It was the vision of Curly Haugland, the president of the NDPC, that led us to this day. Curly has long been an ardent supporter of capitalism and freedom in general. Though me and my staff run the day-to-day operations at the North Dakota Policy Council, Curly's overall guidance is instrumental in shaping what the NDPC is doing and what it will do in the future. And really, it's kind of a neat story how we got the NDPC off the ground. I had been working for the Republican Party in the state for a while and got pretty well disgusted at how it was all about winning elections instead of promoting good, sound ideas. After leaving the party, I started putting together some plans to start a think tank. And I pitched my idea to a friend, someone who I thought might be able to help. And that friend also happened to in the not too distant future, he had a meeting with Curly. And Curly told him that he had some funding for a think tank, but just didn't have anybody to run the day-to-day operations. So our mutual friend put us together, and in early 2007, we opened our doors. Curly is a true entrepreneur. He's an extremely successful businessman, but amazingly hasn't taken a dime from the government. I'm proud to call him a friend and a mentor. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Curly Haugland.
Well, thank you, Brett. That's kind of you. And thank you all for coming. You folks are the first line of defense in this pending struggle for free markets and capitalism against the onslaught and the rush for collectivism, socialization of our economic system. Thank you for being here on such a nice day. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who comes to us from many years of action along these lines. Michael LaFaive is the director of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy's Maury Fiscal Policy Initiative. Maury spelled M-O-R-E-Y. Now, I don't know the name Maury, but I'm sure there's a story behind that, because you don't get an initiative in a policy center named after you for no good reason, or for no ungood reason, I should say. The Mackinac Center for Public Policy is a 20-year-old public policy research institute located in Midland, Michigan, just north, a couple hours north of Detroit. I have to read this here with my long eyes. Forgive me, Michael. I didn't memorize it all. Okay, where are we at? 15 years with the Mackinac Center. Michael has co-authored and authored more than 100 essays, 10 major studies, and fiscal policy issues as diverse as trade, liberalization, government spending, privatization, cigarette taxes, and smuggling, as well as my favorite issue, government economic development initiatives. Most of you recognize me in my activity over the years. I'm fanatically opposed to the government's involvement in the economy by funding economic activity, and I hope Michael won't embarrass me by promoting some kind of government assistance here. So with that, he's done some studies, and I'm sure he's going to tell us about these of the Michigan Economic Growth Authority, along with other public-funded economic development activity. Without further ado, let me introduce to you Michael LaFaive.
Thank you, Curly, for your welcome. I appreciate that, and thank you for your warm welcome. I would love to talk about the Maury Foundation and its generous gift to the Mackinac Center. Before I had even begun at the Mackinac Center full-time 13 years ago, we had the pleasure of meeting a gentleman by the name of Norval Nub Maury, who I'm told showed up at our door one day in dirty overalls and a t-shirt with a check. And he said, "Hi, I'm Norvald. You can call me Nub. I'm a businessman over here in Wynn, about 30 miles away, and I agree with what you're saying. I read it in the paper." And over time, my colleagues built up a friendship with Mr. Morey, and he was just the most fascinating individual. Entrepreneurs are some of my greatest heroes because I think they serve everyone for personal gain in ways that are hard for statists, people who are hostile to commerce, to imagine. Mr. Morey was a high school dropout, and he actually designed at a very young age a wood chipper on a napkin and hired some people to help bring it to fruition, to create it. And now his company, he's deceased now, has 600 employees, and they make, I think, they're the largest manufacturer of wood chippers and other stump grinding type equipment in the world. So it's an extraordinary story, and he gave us our very first $1 million gift. So we, by the way, not only have an initiative named after him, I think we have at least one room named after him. And we're additionally blessed by the fact that his son wanted to carry on his tradition of giving. So some colleagues of mine actually approached Lon Morey and said, "We would like to have an endowed chair of sorts, and we'd like to name it after you for a couple of reasons. One, out of the deep respect for your father, that we've known him a long time and he's been a good friend, and just as our way of saying thank you for continuing to support the Mackinac Center." And he agreed, and he gave us a 7-figure gift to sort of endow or begin an endowment for fiscal policy work. And when he gave me the gift, he said to me, one of the reasons that he made the gift was that so he could, in business parlance, sort of delegate authority. He said, "Look, we're good at making wood chippers, and we're good at generating revenue excess of costs. You're good at public policy. Let's trade our goods." And that's in fact what free trade is based on. So we were blessed with this idea. His father, years earlier, when he presented us with $1 million gift, actually wrote a letter and said to our president, Larry Reed, and said, "You know what, I want people in Michigan and America today to have the same opportunities that I had in the 1950s. If I had to start my business today, in today's regulatory and tax climate, I would not succeed. And so we want you to carry on this mission." And I think that's what every state-based policy think tank in the nation is trying to do. They're trying to make it so people can voluntarily associate for personal gain, more so than they're allowed to do today. You know, in doing so, we actually sort of raise the cost of being a bad champion of policy, or a politician. We raise the cost for politicians and other statists of championing bad policies. I'd like to put it, I'll just show you really quick in economic terms. If I could put Tom's pedagogical tool up on the board again. This is the demand for, let's say, bad legislation by politicians. And this is the supply, and this is the price politicians are willing to endure to champion that bad policy in the initial quantity. Organizations like the North Dakota Policy Council, the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and other state-based think tanks are charged with raising the cost of championing bad public policy. And what happens when you raise the cost? The quantity demanded of bad legislation. So, thank you very much. If you're a supporter of the North Dakota Policy Council for doing so, I can tell you as an employee of the Mackinac Center, it's wonderful to be able to do what we do and fight the battle every day. Well, with that said, I am always reminded at events such as this, whether I'm in the audience or whether I get to speak, of this great story in speech-giving history. And it involves a story out of Great Britain. There was a gentleman who is not only known as a great businessman, but a provocative speaker by the name of Joseph Chamberlain. He was the son of Neville Peace in Our Time Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England at one time. And he was invited to give an after-dinner talk at a major major city in London. And the dinner plates were being cleared away at this event, and drinks were being brought out, after-dinner drinks were being brought out, and apparently this mayor leaned over to his guest and said, "Shall we let the people enjoy themselves a bit longer, or shall we have your speech now?" So hopefully if you brought some refreshments in from your break, you'll be able to enjoy those and my discussion as well. Well, economic growth and development are very hot topics right now. And economic growth typically refers to increasing levels of real output of goods and services over a particular time in an economy. But economic development typically refers to a broader phenomenon of rising standards of living and quality of life. Taken together, these two concepts are frequently summed up by politicians and pundits simply as jobs. And I don't blame them for doing so. I use the technique myself because it not only simplifies matters, but it makes them far more personal. People understand what it's like to have their livelihood threatened or to see friends or loved ones lose their jobs. So this is a hot topic around the globe. In fact, jobs are such a hot topic right now that they have practically replaced the children as a shield behind which politicians will hide when they want to introduce some new legislation or propose increasing spending. Now, I have a lot of personal experience with this because Michigan has effectively experienced a one-state recession. From 2002 to 2007, when the rest of the nation was expanding, Michigan was actually ended up having negative growth. So I noticed over time politicians saying, well, we have to increase spending on education, it's for the children. We have to make smoking illegal everywhere, it's for the children. And believe it or not, I'm not making this one up, we have to have government subsidized broadband in rural areas for the children. That was a Michigan thing, by the way, after 9/11, because that's how they were hoping to communicate if all the cell phones were blacked out due to an attack in Ishpeming, Michigan. So that's the logic they were using to advance this. But because of this economic contraction worldwide, jobs have become the new children. Jobs, jobs, jobs. And now politicians and governments around the world are passing all sorts of these government stimulus packages in the hope of creating net new jobs where they don't exist now, growth and development, as I've already defined them. The question is, do they work? In fact, another question is, at every level of government, do these interventions in the name of creating net new jobs, growth and development work anywhere? We think that's a very open question. Now, I doubt that this audience would be surprised to learn that governments at every level frequently meddle in their economies in some very narrow and targeted fashion in the hope of affecting some type of economic outcome, usually a positive one, so they can claim that jobs have been created. Let me give you an idea of how big the scope of this is. 4 or 5 years ago, two different sets of economists working apart came to the conclusion that state and local governments alone annually spend $40 to $50 billion a year in the name of creating new jobs, or perhaps different ones, or improving the productivity of existing ones. The empirical evidence, however, suggests that we might all be better off if they just left everyone to their own devices. These economic development programs, or ECO-DEVO for short, can run the gamut from business tax breaks in the form of direct tax credits, sales tax breaks, sales tax holidays, personal property tax abatements on machinery and equipment, and one of my personal favorites, outright cash subsidies, frequently disguised as refundable tax credits. By the way, tax credits in surveys are more palatable to a voter than are cash subsidies, and I think it's because they recognize that there's a robbing of Peter to pay Paul going on there. So they often, at least in Michigan, introduce refundable tax credits rather than just saying, we're going to give cash to these particular companies. Well, politicians and their lieutenants and countless cheerleaders for what has come to be known as state industrial policy, basically picking winners and losers in marketplace through government action, have no shortage of rationalizations for doing so. A politician might see what they think is a blighted area and then rush in with legislation in the hope of making it less blighted, by their definition, to improve worker job skills, to increase tourism. After all, if people from outside the state come into the state and leave money at the card table, that's money that wasn't here beforehand. So there's venture capital initiatives. In Michigan and other states, the economic development program du jour is film subsidies for Hollywood moguls. They will even talk about the need to diversify economies, and not just a state economy, but local economies, and even then within industries. Yes, we have an automobile industry, and that's great, but we need different types of jobs within that industry. The list goes on. Now, these programs and their related impacts and the desired goals are so common from state to state that they frequently amount to little more than fads, as I've already a word I've already used. Now, I'd like to share with you just one example of where the political class rushed in the hope of addressing a subject and protecting their favorite turf, all in the name of economic development. About 2005 or 2006, we started hearing this constant chirping that the higher education community needs more money per student. And this time, we'd never heard them say this before, it was for the jobs. They were arguing that giving the higher education establishment more money would create more economic development. And their logic was, well, with more money, more students will come into the universities. More students will graduate. They'll be smarter and thus more productive. And productive people get paid more. Thus, higher paid people will be spending money and it'll raise all boats. Now, the Mackinac Center leapt into the fray there and pointed out many of the practical and theoretical reasons for the shortcomings of this for this logic and what was wrong with it. But fortunately, there was an economist at Ohio University by the name of Richard Vedder. You may have heard this name before. He's a very talented speaker and scholar. And he actually went ahead and collected data from, I think, 48 contiguous states on higher education spending, performance, and state economic performances. And he pounded this data from every known direction. He did scores and scores of regressions looking for some type of link between spending on higher ed and economic growth in the state. And he found a link, and it was negative. He actually found that states that spent more of a proportion of this personal income on higher ed tended to have slower rates of economic growth as measured by personal income. It was personal income growth he was looking at. When he gave a speech for the Mackinac Center, he used North and South Dakota as his primary example. He said, "These states are remarkably similar in many aspects. They share a common culture, topography, geographic size, sparse populations, and of course, the obligatory brutal winters comment." I know you've heard the obligatory Fargo comment already today, so the movie Fargo, so I had to throw that in there. But then he detailed how these states chose to be different through public policy. He said that since at least 1977, North Dakota had spent more per capita than South Dakota on higher education. Over the preceding 2 decades, North Dakota increased its education spending while South Dakota lowered its proportion of expenditures that went to higher education until North Dakota was dedicating about twice the proportion of its state income on colleges and universities than South Dakota. Yet he found, despite this, South Dakota enjoyed faster personal income growth and less out-migration. A word that you may have heard a lot because I know that Michigan and North Dakota compete in the out-migration category a lot, so I'm familiar with that link. In fact, by one estimate from United Van Lines, a private source, South Dakota was a high inbound state, according to them, while North Dakota, their sister to the north, was a high outbound state in this survey. Now, before many of you just dismiss the United Van Lines data and say, well, you know, there could be a selective bias there. This is a big company. Wealthier people tend to use moving companies, or firms locating executives will hire them on your behalf. We actually took the United Van Lines data and we did a statistical analysis against actual census data. And we found the two to be very highly correlated. So United Van Lines basically represents census data a year before it comes out, and you can obtain it on a monthly basis. And what they've told us is that, by the way, this isn't exactly bragging rights, Michigan has displaced North Dakota in the #1 position for outbound traffic. So some good news for you there. There's other good news, but I wanted to take time to point that one out. Now, that said, I couldn't help but notice about 10 days ago while I was preparing for my remarks, I was on the website looking for North Dakota statistics, and I came across what else? an article on the appropriation that was passed by the legislature to fund higher education. And it actually said, and it took me back, it actually said there was an increase of 70%. Was that a typo? Okay. It staggered me. I stepped back. I could not believe what I was seeing, especially when I knew what they'd done over the previous couple of decades thanks to Richard Vedder. So I read down further, getting more and more tense, thinking, I know what's coming. They're going to say it's for economic development. And sure enough, a legislator says, referring to out-of-state students, while they are here, they have jobs. They pay taxes. They live in houses. They buy things, and they add to our economy. But remember, as Milton Friedman loved to say, there are no free lunches in economics. Someone had to pay for that, and it's coming out of job providers' pockets or private investors and consumers paying taxes every day. Subsidizing a student body, whether it's out of state or not, with the hope that they remain to work, invest, and raise a family is a very dangerous gambit when you have a sister state to the south that's just a short drive over and that apparently has lower taxes and greater economic opportunity. Now, this is just one example, of course. My own governor, Governor Granholm, has introduced every sort of program in the desperate attempt to appear as though they're doing something to address Michigan's one-state recession. The economic development programs that they introduce are great for ribbon-cutting ceremonies. They're great for saying, we're going to create jobs. But they're not necessarily good for creating jobs, and I'll get to the reasons why in just a moment. But she's introduced a particular large-scale program to bring high tech to Michigan in the hope of diversifying away from our automobile industry. Incidentally, every governor back to Kim Sigler in 1947 in the state of Michigan has introduced either an entire department or a program under the banner of diversifying Michigan's economy away from the automobile industry. Now, we're being diversified today, all right, but it's not because of a vision a politician had 40 years ago who said, you know what, I think insurance and health care is the way to go, and then start programs for insurance and health care. By the way, we are being diversified. 25% of our employment base has disappeared at this decade. So something is going to have to replace it, but I do not hold out a lot of hope that politicians are going to be able to sit on the mountaintop and think, okay, I know what the next one is, and then subsidize the right one. Well, the Hollywood filmmakers, I bring these up a couple of times. That's the economic development package du jour, or I should say is becoming passé. And I bring it to your attention because it's one of these fads that's skipping from state to state. Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, Michigan, and there's a little micro war between these states, and it's escalating. So be careful, because this program could be coming to a theater near you if you're not careful. Well, politicians and central planning elites obviously love this stuff, but I wonder if they ever consider asking, does it actually work? Or do they actually care if it works? And if it doesn't work, what might facilitate economic growth and development? What might policymakers do to make an economy better? There are mountains of evidence on the subject of economic development programs run by state and local units of government that do a little more than suggest they don't work. Now, I don't have time to detail all of them for you without boring you to tears and losing half of you, but I can offer some broad strokes to give you an idea of just how much evidence there is out there. Before diving into that, however, I want to underscore that I don't blame corporations or businesses for taking what is offered. Indeed, many business managers actually have a fiduciary responsibility to lower their cost of doing business. I take tax credits on my own personal income tax. Some people take tax credits they shouldn't be taking, all to lower their own tax burden. Self-interest is a powerful thing. It is government and politicians in this respect that deserve our scorn here for continuing to follow in a policy direction in the face of persistent evidence that the economic development empires they champion are at best a neutral force in our lives. So what is the evidence? One of my favorite and the most reaching is a 2004 paper by two University of Iowa economists, Peter Fisher and Alan Peters. They actually did what's called a meta-review of the academic literature. There's so much literature out there that many economists have taken 20 or 30 economic development studies, summarized them, reported their findings, and then commented on them and published it as their own paper. That's called a literature review. Well, there are so many literature reviews out there on this subject that these guys did literature review of the literature review. So they've actually, tangentially at least, come into contact with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of economic development studies of every sort. And their conclusion was very interesting, but I thought that their title summed it up better. Their paper is called, quote, "The Failures of Economic Development Incentives." And they tried to answer three important questions when they were looking at the literature. First, do the programs improve growth and development in a way that would exist absent these programs? Second, are they targeted to low-income populations? And third, do the costs of these programs outweigh any conceivable benefits that might occur from them? As with a great deal of academic literature, their review was mixed, but it leaned toward showing that these programs were ineffective or the costs exceeded the alleged benefits. Now, I want to quote at length from their paper. The upshot of all of this is that on the most basic question, whether incentives induce significant new investment or jobs, we simply do not know the answer. Since these programs probably cost state and local governments about $40 to $50 billion a year, one would expect some clear and undisputed evidence of their success. This is not the case. In fact, there are very good reasons, theoretical, empirical, and practical, to believe that economic development incentives have little or no impact on firm location and investment decisions. And he's offering advice now. We need to begin by lowering policymakers' expectations about their ability to micromanage economic growth and making the case for a more sensible view of the role of government, providing the foundations of growth through sound fiscal practices, quality public infrastructure, and good education systems, and then letting the economy take care of itself. In 2005, Michael Hicks and I, he was from Ball State University, did an empirical study on Michigan's premier economic development program. We've been in the business a long time and have been throwing everything at this. This is a program that in the first 9 years of its existence offered up $3 billion in economic incentives in the hope of creating jobs where they might not otherwise be. So we built a model to control for all sorts of variables that might influence the output so we could tease out the model's impact, if there was any, on the state. And we found that during the first 7 years, there was zero impact on per capita personal income, unemployment, or the employment rate in our state. We did find that for every $123,000 in tax credits just offered, one construction job was created. 75% of them disappeared in the first year, the rest disappeared in the following year. So they were very transitive. Now, how about the record elsewhere? Maybe there's something about the U.S. that's different. Maybe there's something about states that are different, or local governments. Literature reviews, again, suggest otherwise, but there's a very recent study. It came out just last year with an international flair, and they actually cited the literature I've already cited to you when they started their own research. And they looked at economic development programs on the island of Puerto Rico and in Israel. And they came to the same conclusion that the rest of us have been coming to. And they said, in a nutshell, that there was a temporary boost in employment, but that disappeared. And specifically with regard to the Puerto Rico program they studied in the early 1990s, they said it was repealed on the grounds that it was arguably inefficient and probably ineffective for sustaining Puerto Rican economic growth. Now, as an aside here, I'd like to point out a small miracle in case nobody noticed it. A government program was repealed because it didn't work. Now, you remember that old line about the closest thing to immortality is a government program? Not in this case. So there's reason to be hopeful. We can have an influence. Someone influenced politicians and said, look, I can show you this particular program doesn't work, and they made it go away. Of course, these are just the broad strokes. I'm willing to bet the audience here is familiar themselves with specific examples of instances where a state or local unit of government offered incentives to a particular firm or industry that blew up in their face. Most recently in North Dakota, you have the example of alien technology. Have you seen this one in the paper? A firm reportedly supported by millions of dollars, or at least offered millions of dollars in state and local incentives in exchange for creating 1,100 jobs. The company has decided to close its Fargo plant despite the fact that they've been provided or offered all of these incentives, and implicitly declared a winner by economic development mandarins somewhere. Mandarins who will probably not have to pay for this loss like a private investor would have to pay if they invested their own money in a company that failed, which is very important given the incentives here that are offered. In fact, with politicians, I think you'll understand that talk can sometimes be cheap. And in Michigan, we have this great example of it. A few years back, when Michigan was recognized as having a one-state recession, our Republican Party leapt into the fray. They issued a press release saying, jobs are more important to us than anything. Come hear us talk about how we're going to create more jobs. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Lengthy press release on what they wanted to do by way of public policy. So I heard this on the radio, and I called them up and I said, please fax me your press release. The poor, probably underpaid or no paid intern faxed me the press release, but accidentally attached to it the Republicans' 13-page internal strategy document. Okay? It had 3 columns in it. The name of their program, a column for the political value of the idea, a column for the media value of the idea, but in 13 pages did not once mention the economic value of their ideas. Talk is cheap for politicians. This is why we're here. We have to raise the price. But with that digression out of the way, why don't these programs work? When I read these academic studies, I keep waiting for them to explain. They typically just explain whether they think it's effective or not effective, but don't necessarily go into detail of why there's a fundamental reason these programs fail. I'd like to offer some theoretical and practical explanations. First, government has nothing to give anyone it doesn't first take from someone else. To paraphrase Milton Friedman, you've probably heard this already once today, there are no free lunches in economics. This is why it's called the dismal science. Economists are forever running around the world telling people that everything has a cost, even if it's just an opportunity cost. So whether we're telling the masses or a dictator, as was mentioned earlier, we get in trouble, we're not popular because we have to tell people that's not free. It's going to come from somewhere. Now, in this case, for the government to encourage economic growth in one area, it must necessarily suppress it in another area, or in a bunch of other little areas which offset any good they can hope to do by facilitating the financing of a company or providing tax incentives to lower the cost and that sort of thing. Even when tax credits are involved, there's an opportunity cost involved because it makes it harder to cut taxes for everyone. Unfortunately, the day-to-day activities of these programs generate a lot of positive public relations for their sponsors and for the companies themselves, because people care about jobs, they get their press release, and the media tends to run out and just talk about the benefits of it. But if I was an accountant and I went to my boss and I said, here's your balance sheet, and it just had the asset side listed, I'd said, hey, business is great, I'd probably be fired. And that's exactly what's taking place. Here's a better illustration. What if I robbed a bank in Bismarck and spent all the money at a mall in Fargo? Would anybody issue a press release saying, hey, business is great at the local mall? Press, come out and interview the merchants here. This is a great thing going on. No. They would recognize that someone had to lose in order for someone to gain. And that would be the logic. Now, I realize that a bank robbery is a little more dramatic than most development programs, and I also realize that development programs tend to disperse the loot in a farther shotgun spread. But this is how the stories are reported. Here's the building. It's the seen versus the unseen, as Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt like to say. Look at the great plant we've created thanks to my new development legislation. It wouldn't have existed if you wouldn't have voted me into office. Moreover, these programs represent a very inefficient way of transferring wealth. In every transaction, there has to be a middleman. If somebody robs me, they tend to just go on their way. But with a government program, you have an expensive bureaucracy in the middle of every transaction, approving particular offers to create jobs or disapproving them, or running down to the legislature to defend an existing program or to advocate for a new one and demand more money. These are costs that are imposed on the economy as a whole. If instead of paying large, expensive bureaucracies to do this, we simply left those resources in the hands of job-creating entrepreneurs, I'm willing to bet they could create jobs with that money too. Next up on the theoretical explanation for economic eco-devo's ineffectiveness, would-be central planners must face what Friedrich Hayek called the knowledge problem. Hayek said, look, knowledge is essentially dispersed throughout an economy and through millions and millions of minds, through millions and millions of people who are all working to maximize their own self-interest independent of what planners may have in mind for them. Hayek called this idea that central planners, however talented and caring, could somehow survey the whole of society, grasp it in all its nuance and detail, and then reorganize the parts in a way that would make things better than they would be if they simply left everyone alone, the fatal conceit of economic planning. Now, to give you an idea of how planning an entire economy, or even a small part of it, might be, I'd like to give you an illustration first brought to my attention by Paul Romer, the famous Stanford economist. He would ask, rhetorically, how many ways can you arrange just 3 items? Pretend these are playing cards. How many ways? This is a factorial problem. Anybody know? There's probably an economist over here who might know that one. 6. 3 times 2 times 1 is 6. Now, how many ways can you arrange or rearrange just 20 items? It's an exponential problem here. It quickly skyrockets to 2 quintillion, or all of the seconds that comprise 75 billion years. That's just 20. You could take a deck of playing cards and imagine that in all of card playing history, there are arrangements that have never actually happened yet, because there are that many possible combinations. But what are central planners dealing with? Millions factorial. They're dealing with 6 billion people on the planet who all have their own self-interest, first of all. Then if they want to create a business or industry or diversify one, they have to think about marketing and finance and trends and purchasing, as well as the desire of their political bosses who may have goals that are different than what's actually written in the language of a particular bill. So you can see how difficult it is to centrally plan an economy. Now, individuals, entrepreneurs, they face the knowledge problem too, but they have an advantage that government doesn't. First, they need to concern themselves with knowledge that is most important to their needs at that moment, or their own needs when they're planning for their future. And if something goes wrong, they can make corrections a heck of a lot quicker than a government bureaucracy can make. And since they're spending their own resources, it's a lot easier to admit you've made a mistake and make that correction. Now, continuing on my tour of the theoretical waterfront for the reasons these programs fail, is this concept of rent-seeking. First, rent-seeking is more evidence that economists should not be allowed to name their own theories, because we often call things names that are difficult to comprehend. Rent-seeking is simply favor-seeking. It's using government to obtain higher than normal rents or returns on your investment than you would make otherwise competing in the marketplace. Harold Broom, an economist with the General Accountability Office, thought that there's enough rent-seeking in capitals around the U.S. that he might investigate it and see if if this rent-seeking activity in state capitals has any effect on the economic growth rates of states as a whole. So he collected all of this data and did a bunch of regressions, and he actually found a relationship, and it was negative. The more favor-seeking apparatus that was in a state capital, the more lawyers and lobbyists and contractors looking for favors and special deals, the slower the real rate of economic growth was in that state. So he concluded, and I want to read to you from his study, the implication is that a state government which promulgates policies that foster sustained artificial rent-seeking does so at considerable expense to its economic growth. And he continued, To the extent that economic growth is desired, a goal of public policy should be the restraint of government interventions that create and sustain artificial rents. But that's exactly what economic development programs do. They create and sustain artificial rents. In fact, it's like hanging out a dinner bell for rent seekers. Come and get it. It's here for the taking. You just have to fill out this paperwork and promise us to create jobs. Now, I'm being a little unfair. It's probably a little more stringent than that. But I would argue, in fact, there's another reason that these programs are problematic that I should mention. There's a fairness question. All too often, we see businesses that pay full freight be forced to pay taxes to support their own competition. And here in my state of Michigan, we saw Kogel Meats. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of them, but they are literally Flint, Michigan's only growth industry. They've been there 90 years, have never taken a dime of taxpayer money. Then one day on the way to work, the president is listening to the radio and he hears that the state of Michigan has offered $500,000 to his competition from New York to move to Michigan and compete directly with them. It's not only bad economics, it's unfair. A solution that I think would be much more conducive to economic growth and development would be what I call the Fair Field and No Favors Act. Instead of having economic development programs where people would have to go and say we could really use tax relief and have politicians handing them out to groups that they think will facilitate growth and development in an area or state, we recommend rolling back the burden on all businesses and citizens as well. I would argue in Michigan we had 120,000 businesses on the hook for what we called the single business tax. Less than 200 of them got business tax relief through our main program. So I would tell politician after politician, look, if you cut taxes for all businesses, there's a very good chance that they'll create at least as many jobs as you think will be created with this program. The only difference is that it'll be harder for you to take credit for them, which made them recoil, of course. They love their ribbon-cutting ceremonies. But after all, every concession offered to a particular business and industry is essentially an implicit admission that it costs too much to do business or live in a particular state or area. Now, before I conclude, I want to offer just a little sage warning that you probably already are familiar with. I hope that you will be aware of frequently very well-intentioned people in business and government and academia to use the worldwide economic slowdown as an excuse for greater intervention in our lives, whether they're business or not. We're seeing this already at the national level. Did anybody see Rahm Emanuel's quote about, hey, we can't let a good crisis go to waste, or something to that effect? That happens at the state and local units of government as well. And I fear that statists everywhere may use this crisis to invent or expand more economic development programs, just like I saw in Michigan when we were having our one-state recession. By the way, welcome to our recession. I know other states didn't have to go through what we did, but it's getting worse for us too. Now, as was mentioned earlier, I've been with the Mackinac Center for 15 years now, and this is one of my passions. So I've been around this economic development track a few times. And I can tell you, if not warn you, that virtually every single government economic development intervention either originates in the academic universe, or they're the ones providing talking points or sophisticated analyses that allegedly purport that thousands of jobs will be created if you just listen to the political class one more time. You should take that with a grain of salt. In fact, just a week or two ago, we had there was a study done about Michigan's film industry, and the Economist came out and said, great, it works, it creates tons of jobs. Having been through this before, I called the Economist they hired, the state hired to analyze the program, and I said, hey, just out of curiosity, I noticed you did this modeling. Did you include the costs of the program in the model? And he goes, no. He said, no, we just wanted to see the impact on the film industry on Michigan's economy. And I was taken aback once again. One of the first things that budding economists learn is that everything in the world has a cost. So he was out there saying that this is a great program while purposely excluding all the costs associated with it. So of course the model was going to say it does great things. beware of the academic universe on that one. So here's my final and sage warning. Be sensitive to the promises of politicians and other pundits promising King Canute economics, where they can either command the waves not to splash, or to splash at a particular location on a beach at a particular time of day. It's very difficult to do so, but the economic storms are frequently the shield behind which planners advance their latest interventions. There is a mountain of empirical and evidence that purposeful government-directed economic development planning typically fails to live up to its expectations. Rather than embrace more of the same, I would recommend that Americans, Michiganians, North Dakota, people from North Dakota simply started to remove obstacles to freedom of association and trade, and let a diversified people with diversified interests invest and consume as they see fit. The sum total of their work and their lives may very well create far more economic growth and development, make an economy stronger, and even more diversified than it might otherwise be if it was directed by the iron fist of government. And thank you very much for your time and attention. I appreciate that. Do you have time for questions? Apparently we have some time for some questions. Yeah. Okay.
First of all, I misspoke to you before. Apparently, I was told we do have film subsidies, and there is a film commissioner.
Is there really? We've had one film commissioner that's been around for 10 or 15 years, even before we had subsidies for filmmakers. It was her job to go to Hollywood and just try to persuade over expensive dinners these Hollywood moguls to come to Detroit or come to Michigan. But what they did when they came was they usually made a movie using the worst slum in Detroit, which broadcast our reputation around the world. So in the long run, even in the short run, it wasn't working for us.
Okay, now I have a question.
Okay.
In a state like North Dakota, which is heavily reliant on oil and coal and agriculture, when you start talking about economic development programs, and because like you said, they all hide behind the term diversity,
right.
Economy. And they say, well, look at our economy. All we have is energy and agriculture. What have you found to be effective means to combat that argument?
That we only have a few industries?
Yeah.
Well, I have typically said, yeah, and for going back to 1947, Michigan basically had two industries too. We had automobiles and we had agriculture. But after what, almost 60 years of attempts by every governor with a myriad of different programs spending billions upon billions upon billions, they're still talking about the need to diversify. Maybe it would have been better if you wouldn't have instituted an income tax. In the state of Michigan, we had the fourth highest output in the nation the year before we instituted our income tax. And you can actually see our economic performance decline. And then we instituted a business tax, and then it started declining even more. And then other states started passing market-friendly legislation like right-to-work laws. And our performance started dropping even further. So I would argue that, first of all, take an economic Hippocratic oath and first do no harm. And that happens when you raise taxes on businesses, when you impose new regulations and that sort of thing. Beyond that, I would look to states that have better economic performances but similar backgrounds. How different is South Dakota? By one measure, they're the #1 performing state in America in terms of economic development and growth. In that same measurement, North Dakota is 12th. So what might you do more of that South Dakota is doing now?
The North Dakota State University Econ Department is assigned listing the money brought in annually by the Fargo Bill. And I'm just wondering, why is it so widespread, especially at the college level, and all you're taught in the textbooks, is you're taught Keynes and all this, and I never even heard of the Austrians until Money You Make, and they were mentioned once in passing.
Well, first of all, the economic development programs are widespread because they work for political capitalists. You see, political capitalists are as self-interested as John D. Rockefeller was and other existing capitalists, but it manifests itself differently. They try to maximize their own profits by maximizing votes, by maximizing power, by maximizing the opportunities for post-government employment. And you see this all the time. Now, okay, and the Fargo Dome. Now, was the money being brought in by the Fargo Dome, was this an economic development package? Because I hope it is, because there's a raft of other evidence on dome building.
It was a sales tax, and then they try to use that to pay for the Fargo Dome.
So they added a sales tax to build a dome for economic development purposes.
Well, that was the football team, but...
Oh, well.
But, I mean, they said it was justified to say it brought, this amount of concerts and football games in, and it brought in this amount of all the money. So,
You get the same sort of impact studies that don't take into account costs.
Not only that, but the impact studies I talked about are even more prevalent when it comes to these domes and conventions and single sporting events, and they're even more ridiculous. With the Detroit Super Bowl in 05 or 06, they hired a college professor in Michigan. He came out and said it's going to create all these jobs. A reporter called me about it. I said, would you call him back and ask him if he used the Remy model, the in-plan model, and if he included all the costs? And the reporter called me back moments later and he goes, you're not going to believe this. And I said, I bet I will. And he said, they used that in-plan model you talked about, and they ignored all the costs. And he said that what he did was he went to the Houston Super Bowl experience and got all the spending that occurred and then just extrapolated it to Michigan. And I said, well, did you ask him why he didn't ask for their costs? And he said no, but he said that he promised to go back and redo the model after the Super Bowl. So, yes?
Well, I think there's a lot of people in government that are well-meaning about economic development. But one of the things that we get into is we have to put out this economic development because we're competing to attract business. So how do you deal with that? And it seems like it's self-perpetuating. If we don't have economic development, we don't offer things to people, then the companies won't come here. And in the Wall Street Journal, you read all the time about the competition, different public entities to attract business. So how do you deal with that?
The specific words that our politicians use are, we can't unilaterally disarm.
Right.
Okay, well, my argument is, you're not armed. You're fighting with a squirt gun. In Michigan, arming yourselves would be eliminating the Michigan business tax and passing a right to work law, but they don't want to touch that because they want pleasure to pain. In fact, a colleague of mine, my late colleague Joe Overton, likes to say that every living thing prefers pleasure to pain. So if they don't want the pleasure of broad-based policies, we have to give them pain by raising that price. Now, I recognize that as a legitimate argument from a political point of view, and I've also said to my friends who are in the legislature, well, friends in quotes, I mean people I work with down there, I say, look, if you're afraid, after looking at all the evidence I've shown you, to prove that these programs absolutely do not create jobs and you could eliminate them despite other states retaining theirs and still be no worse off, fine. But in every single one of your press releases, you must confess up front that you know these programs don't work. And you have to do it because you're competing for perception and the desire to remain in office. Yes?
One more. I've suggested over the years that one solution would be to require everybody that attends the ribbon cutting has to be at the bankruptcy hearing.
I'd like to maybe do you one better, and it involves something that's known as transparency. You've probably heard a lot of talk about transparency. I know that North Dakota Policy Council has had a major victory on the transparency front with their website. I'd like to take the economic development, that idea to economic development. All of these politically appointed panels who are picking winners and losers in the marketplace, those individuals should be forced to put their own stock portfolios on the website so we can see how well they have done picking winners and losers in the marketplace with their own money. Because if they can't outperform a market index, why should we believe that in a political environment they could pick more winners and losers with my money than they could with theirs? All right, thank you very much.